program is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.CWRTDC.org.
Our speaker is Carl Guarneri. He's the brother James Ash Professor of History at St. Mary's College in California, where he's taught since 1979 after receiving a PhD from Johns Hopkins. So he was educated around here. Dr. Guarneri is the author or editor of 10 books, several of which pursue transnational approaches to the study of 19th century American history. Having taught courses in the Civil War for more than 3 decades, he set out to make an original contribution to the field as a result of Lincoln's informer, Charles Dana, in the inside story of the Union War, which we're going to hear about tonight, which I'm looking forward to because I've gotten really into Grant, and I think we might not have had Grant if it wasn't for Dana. The book was a 2020 top 10 selection in the Civil War books and authors, and won the 2020 Albert Castle Award of the Kalamazoo Civil War Roundtable for the best book on the Western theater of the Civil War.
So, hi, first of all, I want to say hi, and thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I wanted to underline just a couple of things, in that introduction, and that is, I really am not a Civil War historian. This is my first foray into original work on the Civil War. I've been teaching it for a long time, but my fields of research have lain elsewhere. But there were just too many roads that sort of led to Charles Dana. One was that as you say, I didn't want to add to the Leaning Tower of Pisa pile of biographies of Lincoln or Stanton or Grant. I wanted to do something more original than that. And I came across Dana really from my first book, which was on utopian communities before the Civil War. And he was a member of Brook Farm community outside Boston. And then I discovered he had a really interesting Civil War career. But beyond that, there were other paths that led there. As I said, I had come across Dana when I was researching Brook Farm and the utopian communities. Then I found out he had a really interesting Civil War career and really under-researched Civil War career. After that, once I got into it, I realized that the images of Dana were pretty extreme. Generally speaking, Grant biographers like him, and Rosecrans biographers hate him because he was responsible in part for the rise of the former, for Grant, but the demise of the latter, Rosecrans. There's also a memoir out there that has sort of deterred further work on Dana. That's Recollections of the Civil War, you see there, which was published in 1898 after first being serialized in McClure's magazine. Turns out that was ghostwritten by Ida Tarbell, the muckraker, who worked for McClure's magazine. She was asked to do it by Sam McClure, the editor, and she interviewed Dana in his office. By then he was old and his memory was faltering. And she just quickly stitched together a memoir from his wartime documents and from the interviews, all of which were rephrased into the first person, and transitions and inferences and suppositions were thrown in there too. The result is it's a real pastiche that has a lot of mistakes in it, I discovered, not to mention whole episodes, important episodes of Dana's Civil War career that were left out. He never did get to review it. He lived only long enough to see in proof maybe 10% of it, but then other 90% he had died, and she just went ahead and published it anyway. He had such a varied Civil War career that it's another reason I chose him. He was sort of a behind the scenes character who had a hand in so many different aspects of the Civil War that I could use him as a vehicle to pretty much tell the whole story, almost the whole story of the Union side of the war, leaving out Antietam and Gettysburg, which he wasn't directly involved with. So much else he was. And so his career becomes a sort of window into the Civil War. My friends used to tease me that I was writing on this, the Forrest Gump of the Civil War, who sort of showed up at all the right times in all the right places.
Mhm.
Yeah, as I mentioned, he began, well, let me just start from the beginning. He's a New England boy from a broken family. His mother died when Dana was young. His father farmed out the kids to relatives and then remarried and moved out to Ohio and pretty much ignored his kids after that, except for scolding letters once in a while. So Dana grew up with uncles, and one of them was in Buffalo, and that's where he spent the majority of his time. In Buffalo, New York, he fell in with an ambitious group of young men. He kind of got sponsored by a doctor in Buffalo, who then helped to prep him in his schooling to the point where he knew enough Latin and Greek to be able to get into Harvard. And so he was admitted to Harvard. Unfortunately, couldn't afford to stay. He did well there, but couldn't afford to stay, and also suffered eye strain from nighttime reading. And the solution to that was this Brook Farm community, where he could teach in the school, he could help manage the affairs. There were a number of Harvard ex-ministers there and social dreamers, so much to the point where Dana was one of the most practical people in the community. And he was the right-hand man of the community leader, George Ripley. When Brook Farm collapsed, Dana actually was in New York getting married. He had fallen in love with one of the young women at the community. They kind of eloped, went off to New York City to get married. And while he was there, the main building, the main dormitory at Brook Farm burned down accidentally. It was under construction. And he had to fetch around for other occupations. Fortunately, he had a kind of apprenticeship because they put out a weekly newspaper at the community, the Harbinger, and he had done a lot to make that happen, written editorials, written book reviews, etc. And he had attracted the attention of a fellow traveler of Brook Farm, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, and Greeley took him on at the Tribune in 1847. And he was a valuable enough member that he worked his way up very quickly. When the 1848 revolutions broke out in France, Dana convinced Greeley to allow him to go there and report back. He contracted with 4 newspapers in the United States to send letters, not identical letters, back home. So he covered the 1848 revolutions, to the June days in Paris, to the election of Louis Napoleon as president of France, with side trips to Germany and Vienna. Very sharp reporting that has really been undervalued and also just under researched. I've actually gotten together about 92 of his newspaper letters back home, and I'm contemplating doing an edited book of those reports. One of the things he did there is in Cologne, he met Karl Marx, and he was able to recruit Karl Marx to be a foreign correspondent for the New York Tribune, to report on affairs in France, Germany, and England. This was actually Marx's main source of income for the 11 years that he was working at the Tribune. And when Dana left the Tribune, really cut Marx out. And so Dana was really his contact and his employer at the Tribune. Of course, he was against the spread of slavery, just like Greeley, and even more militant about it. Dana campaigned for Fremont in 1856, he supported Lincoln wholeheartedly, more wholeheartedly than Greeley did in 1860. And as the cartoon sort of shows, he sort of minded the shop when Greeley went to Chicago in 1860, not the Republican convention, not to get Lincoln nominated, but to prevent William Seward from being nominated, Greeley's arch rival in New York Whig politics and then later Republican politics. Greeley succeeded in convincing a lot of the delegates that Seward was not electable, but his own favorite, Edward Bates of Missouri, was a true dark horse and did not get anywhere near enough votes to be nominated. And Lincoln slipped in as a Midwesterner who had all the requisite characteristics, requirements to be a fairly successful nominee. Immediately after Lincoln's election was certified, as you know, South Carolina left the Union, and eventually the Deep South states followed, even before Lincoln was inaugurated in March. Greeley and Dana quarreled about this. Greeley was often out there on the lecture tour or in Washington, D.C. lobbying, but he flirted very seriously with the idea of letting the South go in peace. Peaceable secession, it was called, or peaceable separation. He thought that was the Jeffersonian way. He thought it was a peaceful and non-bloody way. If in fact they wanted it, we should let them go. Dana was adamant that this not happen, and he stiffened the Tribune's editorial line while Greeley was away, saying that secession was treason, that it had to be stopped, and that the South had to be coerced back into the Union. Eventually, Greeley was won over, partly by Lincoln, whose emissaries pleaded with Greeley to stop all this talking about peaceful separation. But it set a pattern where Dana, as deputy editor, was a lot more militant and bellicose than Greeley was. That showed up with Bull Run. Again, Greeley cut his leg with an axe, and he was recuperating at home. And Dana took over the editorial reins and insisted that the Federal Army ought to move against Richmond, forward to Richmond. The rebel Congress must not be allowed to meet. On July 20th, he sort of led the press in a kind of drum roll to get the Union Army moving, green as it was, as Lincoln said. And the result, unfortunately, of course, was first Bull Run. And Greeley took all the grief because everyone thought it was Greeley's doing. Cartoons from Harper's Weekly all targeted Greeley as the man who'd caused all this. But the editorial, for example, the editorial that you see down here was actually penned by Dana, but they're acting as if it's Dana that it's Greeley who did it, and he took all the grief. Greeley was mortified by the Union defeated Bull Run, and although he took responsibility for it, it really escalated the tensions between him and Dana. And yet he did not fire Dana until the end of March of 1862, several months later. And historians always wondered why that happened. Well, I found out. The reason it happened is because Dana did the same thing with General McClellan, that when McClellan's army wasn't moving from Northern Virginia, preparing the elaborate Peninsula campaign, Dana initiated an editorial campaign to get them moving. And the press picked up on that right away and started to criticize Greeley. In Harper's Weekly, he's portrayed in a lunatic asylum, on to Richmond, down with McClellan. In Vanity Fair, he's portrayed as badgering McClellan and Secretary Stanton to move on to Richmond. Just to the left of Stanton is Charles Dana in fisticuffs. So it was recognized even then that Dana was the militant voice behind a New York Tribune. That got him fired. But he wasn't idle for long, because his pro union stance had gotten the attention of Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. They'd opened up a correspondence, and Stanton started to look to appoint him to special tasks as a kind of troubleshooter. The first one was to examine some fraud in Cairo, Illinois. There's a long story there, because it involved later on the same quartermaster who was responsible, partly at least, for the sinking of the Sultana on the Mississippi River, which killed over 1,700 Union soldiers returning from the war. Dana did an investigation with a number of other people that unfortunately cleared that quartermaster and allowed Lincoln to keep, and Grant to keep promoting him. I've got an article on that coming out in the fall in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. So I'll just move on real fast. Next stop for Dana was to shadow Ulysses Grant during the Vicksburg campaign. Lincoln and Stanton were dying for news for what was going on with Grant. He was a copious fighter, but a meager telegrapher, Lincoln complained. So they had very, very little news from him. What rumors floated their way from correspondence was that he was a heavy drinker, that he was wasting his time digging canals all over the place that were never going to work to bypass Vicksburg. So they hit upon the idea of sending Dana under the pretext that he might be investigating the Paymaster's department. There were complaints about that. The truth was, he was supposed to plant himself in Grant's headquarters and report back every day on what was going on. And he did. He embedded himself with Grant. Grant very tactfully, and his chief of staff, Jon Rawlins, took in Dana, befriended him, shared their information with him. They figured that honesty and transparency was really the best policy, and they won him over. He ended up being a champion of Grant's with the administration. He was there for the running of the Vicksburg batteries. He was there for the whole siege, and he was there, as you can see here from Battles and Leaders, he was there when word arrived from General Pemberton that he was going to seek terms for a Confederate surrender, which, as you know, happened on July 4th, 1863. Dana got a lot of important things done during the Vicksburg campaign. He solidified Grant's reputation back in Washington by saying only good things about him. He covered up, as some of you probably know, he covered up a dramatic drinking episode, a binge that Grant went on. Dana accompanied him, but didn't speak about it because he figured that that would jeopardize Grant's chances to continue leading this offensive. And Dana thought Grant was the man who was only one who was going to be able to win. Dana also helped get rid of General John McClernand, a political general who was maneuvering to take Grant's place and antagonize the other generals, Sherman, McClernand, and needed to be pushed out of the way so that Grant could continue the siege operations and supervising the surrender. So yeah, Dana was definitely instrumental in Grant's rise and in his success during the Vicksburg campaign. From there, he went back to Washington, but then quickly was reassigned to General Rosecrans's headquarters in Tennessee because there were doubts about Rosecrans. Stanton, Halleck, Lincoln worried that Rosecrans was a McClellan-style general who was shy about shedding blood, always calling for more reinforcements, overestimating the size of the enemy opposite him, and fighting essentially a war of maneuver after the war had turned into a much more bloody affair. So Dana was sent out to join Rosecrans in mid-Tennessee. By the time he got there, Rosecrans had actually maneuvered Braxton Bragg's army south to the bottom of Tennessee, and then eventually beyond Chattanooga, Rosecrans uncharacteristically pursued Grant across the Tennessee-Georgia border, split his army in three very dangerously, and it turned out that Bragg was, as Dana said, playing possum. He was poised for a counterattack against the details, the three separated divisions of Rosecrans's army. The result of the Battle of Chickamauga, bloody two-day affair that Dana personally witnessed accompanying Rosecrans. On the second day, that red elliptical mark is where Rosecrans's field headquarters had moved to, just north of the Widow Glen cabin where they had spent the night before. And on that morning, Rosecrans made a fatal and well-known mistake of repositioning his army to close what he thought was a gap. And in fact, it opened a large gap near the Dyer House, as you can see, through which James Longstreet's 10,000 strong columns were able to charge, sweeping Rosecrans's army, a good part of it, including Dana and General Sheridan, northeastward, heading toward Chattanooga. The day was only saved by the Rock of Chickamauga, George Thomas making that stand on Snodgrass Hill. Here's the spot where that temporary headquarters was, up on a knoll. And if you can imagine Dana and Rosecrans about 10 o'clock in the morning, looking toward the camera and seeing about 200, 300 yards off, 10,000 Confederates charging virtually unobstructed at them, to the point where the trees were being snapped over their heads, and Rosecrans's aide got shot in the wrist. They skedaddled back into the woods. Dana headed south, actually, to try to make contact with the rest of the Union Army, or the right flank of the Union Army, but they were no longer there. Rosecrans headed north back to Chattanooga. He left his chief of staff, Garfield, to look after the northern end of the Union line where Thomas was holding out. But this is the only occasion that I'm aware of that a Union commander fled the field, during a battle, went back to Chattanooga to try to organize defenses there. And this was a big stain on Rosecrans's reputation after that. Dana's telegram, he was in the thick of it, so he sort of overestimated how bad a defeat it was. It was really a tactical defeat, not a strategic one, because the Union still held Chattanooga, which really was their objective. But Dana's telegram was, "My report was of deplorable importance. Chickamauga is as fatal a name in our history as Bull Run." Unfortunately, all Dana's telegrams were encrypted. They were in cipher. But this one was deciphered. I've forgotten where. I think it's in Louisville, and by one of the Union telegraphers, who then distributed it to the newspapers. And pretty soon it was all over. Instead of a private telegram to Stanton, it was all over the Union press. Dana was furious and pinpointed who the culprit was and demanded that Stanton punish him. Meanwhile, Rosecrans, half broken, retreated back to Chattanooga, where he tried to organize the Union defenses. And this is where Dana's praise for Rosecrans, which had been pretty steady, started to turn into criticism, because Rosecrans dithered and appeared irresolute as to whether his army was going to stay in Chattanooga, whether it needed to be abandoned, how were they going to open a supply route, because that a long triangular route that you see that goes up toward the top of the screen, 60 plus miles overland, since the railroad had been cut and the river was had Confederate pickets along it, Tennessee River. That was the Union's only supply route. So Rosecrans's army and his animals were starving unless he could open a new supply line. And for almost a month, he appeared distracted, confused and stunned like a duck on the head, Lincoln wrote after he read one of Dana's telegrams. And Dana's telegrams got more and more critical of this kind of dithering, especially after it became apparent that there were ways to open up this supply line. And in fact, once Rosecrans got sacked, thanks largely to Dana's telegrams, Grant and Thomas appeared on the scene, and they were able to establish the so-called cracker line, a supply line, quite quickly. There's General Grant having arrived at General Thomas's headquarters in Chattanooga. Charles Dana is the figure all the way on the left. Grant asked Dana to stick around after Rosecrans's sacking and to help him during the Chattanooga offensive. And he did important work for Grant there too. During the battles for Chattanooga, Dana joined Hooker's army for a while when they assisted in the opening of the Browns Ferry cracker line. Dana went back to headquarters, and from the top of Orchard Knob, he watched the Union, from one of the forts, Fort Wood, he watched the Union capture Orchard Knob. He went up to join Sherman on his offensive at the north end of Missionary Ridge, relaying back to Grant what was going on by flag signals. And then by the time the Union was ready for its all-out offensive on Missionary Ridge, he was back on Orchard Knob with Grant and his men, and he could report directly to Stanton what was going on there. And that miraculous charge, frontal charge right up Missionary Ridge that succeeded beyond expectations. Glory to God, the day is decisively ours, was Grant's telegram back to Washington. I'm sorry, Dana's telegram back to Washington. Meanwhile, Dana also did important work for Grant by taking 2 trips up to Burnside. Before the battles for Chattanooga, Dana traveled up to Knoxville with General James Wilson, his buddy, in order to stiffen Burnside's resolve and not have him abandon Knoxville when Longstreet was being detailed up in that direction by Braxton Bragg. And then after the Battle of Chattanooga, November 29th, Dana and Wilson accompanied Sherman's relief expedition to scare Longstreet out of his siege of Knoxville. They never actually fired a shot at Longstreet's army, but he found out they were coming and abandoned his siege and went back to Virginia, so that Knoxville was saved. Lincoln cared very much about Knoxville, maybe even more than Chattanooga, because he saw it as the sort of bastion for East Tennessee Unionists that he was trying very much to succor, to keep in the Union and to make a show of having real relief. So that takes Dana to the end of 1863. He then returned to Washington, where he was officially named Assistant Secretary of War. And in the book, I try to point out many of his duties, which have really gone unrecognized. They certainly were not in the Tarbell memoir. Supervising contracts, investigating frauds, handling a bunch of Union spies, investigating contraband trade, supplying the Union armies in the designing logistics that used trains and ferries to move the Union armies around in large numbers. He was very instrumental in almost every phase of the Union war effort. We have to realize that this so-called organized war that Stanton was running was actually very improvised. And Dana was a kind of troubleshooter that Stanton could appoint to all kinds of different tasks, whatever was needed at the moment. But Dana was also very good in the field, and Stanton and Lincoln understood that. So when Ulysses Grant embarked upon his Virginia overland campaign in April of 1864 and crossed the Rapidan in early May, Lincoln and Stanton had not heard from him for days, and they were very fretful. And they turned to their trusty informer, Charles Dana, to go down there with a small escort to join Grant's army just after the Battle of the Wilderness at headquarters, and follow him for the rest of the, and be embedded with him for the rest of the campaign. And it was Dana who reported Grant's moves back to Stanton and Lincoln, and the degree of his success bolstered confidence in his leadership, and also in effect wrote a lot of the newspaper dispatches, because Stanton took Dana's telegrams and handed them over, redacted them to make them sound sunnier and more positive, handed them over to the Associated Press. And it was Dana's telegrams that gave the Union public a daily update on the progress of Grant's offensive, which of course, as you know, was this grinding two-step dance where each side tried to get the better of the other by flanking each other to the Union left and hoping that the Union Army would get between Lee and Richmond, or would beat Lee at least at important crossroads. It didn't happen, not at the Wilderness, not at Spotsylvania, not at Cold Harbor. And then at Cold Harbor, as you know, Grant made the decision to cross the James and head for Petersburg, the railroad junction, rather than mount some sort of frontal attack on Richmond. After all, the frontal attack on Cold Harbor failed miserably. Timothy O'Sullivan, the photographer, got himself up in a church gable window while Grant's army was on the move, but Grant's headquarters was resting at Massaponax Church, and he took this picture. The pews were brought out. There's Grant with the inevitable cigar. In the middle is Dana. Next to him with the newspaper is John Rawlins. I think I've got a colorized version of this that is closer. Yeah, you can see that Dana got caught in a sort of double exposure, turning his head toward Grant and away from Grant. So he's not all that clear, but you can see the three men on that far bench, church pew. Dana was there for Cold Harbor as well. Neither he nor Grant understood the enormity of the horror of Cold Harbor until it was too late. And so both of them kind of downplayed the loss until later on. There's that iconic photograph by one of Matthew Brady's assistants that was taken at headquarters right after Cold Harbor. Just a few minutes later, Dana was photographed, the same pine tree, same tent, same chair, by Brady's assistant. Dana was there for the crossing of the James, enormous pontoon bridge that Dana reported as a kind of miracle. Although he did point out, Harvard-educated Dana could not resist that Xerxes Bridge across the Hellespont to Greece was actually longer than this. So it wasn't the longest military pontoon bridge in history. He couldn't resist that. The miracle was that Robert E. Lee did not know for a while where Grant was and what he was doing. So the Union Army proceeded immediately to Petersburg, and there they just started too late on their attack on the defenses, which are formidable but not heavily manned at Petersburg. Dana was there. He reported on the gallantry of the African-American soldiers, so much so that when Lincoln visited Petersburg in June, he asked to see the African-American Union troops because he had heard from Dana how well they had fought. But at Petersburg, as you know, the Union Army settled down to a long siege that wasn't going to be broken until April of 1865. Meanwhile, Grant sent Dana up to Washington because the Confederates had launched a counteroffensive, Jubal Early's raid on Washington. And here, Dana was Grant's eyes at the front. Lincoln called Dana the government's eyes at the front. Now he was Grant's eyes up in Washington, reporting to him on what was going on with Jubal Early. Very critical, actually, of how badly the Union Army was acting, how incompetent the generals were up around Washington. And only after Grant sent Horatio Wright's corps up there was Jubal Early sort of foiled and forced to turn around. I'll just go very quickly through some of Dana's other activities, tracking those Canadian agents, Confederate agents, who were embarked on a number of dirty tricks operations in the North, including attempting to set fire to New York City during the 1864 election. Dana was the guy who reported on them, he and his spies. Dana, like the rest of the War Department, propagandized heavily during Lincoln's re-election, using some questionable tactics that I describe in the book to smear the Democrats and to tilt the soldier vote toward the Republicans. Dana was also involved in the lobbying for the 13th Amendment. Unfortunately, that wonderful movie, Lincoln, Steven Spielberg movie, and Tony Kushner movie that showed all that lobbying and trading of positions for votes did not include Dana, but Dana was actually instrumental in securing at least 2 and probably 3 Democratic votes for Lincoln with patronage promises. And I uncover all that in the book. Yeah, one of the things that I had not known about that I was proudest of was uncovering a story where Dana and Stanton colluded to go around Lincoln's authority to stop the contraband trade in Virginia, which was supplying Lee's army with food and medicine while it was fighting Grant. The details are in the book, but it was a really interesting way that they could disobey Lincoln surreptitiously and get away with it, because Lincoln approved the cotton trade, and for various reasons he was led to believe that it was good for industry and good for the Union coffers as well. Dana was there for the second inaugural. There he is in the upper left on the balcony, Lincoln down at the edge of the balcony giving his speech, and up in the middle of the balcony, a man who some historians have identified as John Wilkes Booth. We know he was there at the second inaugural. Again, when Richmond fell, Dana was sent by Stanton to go report on the occupation, make sure that it was proceeding well, and also make sure that Lincoln, who had gone down there, was not going to give away the shop. In other words, that Lincoln was not going to recognize the state, Confederate state government of Virginia. He came very close to doing so, with the idea that the state government of Virginia, the Confederate state government of Virginia, would then officially take the Confederates out of the war. This was a very dangerous thing to do, to actually recognize Confederate state government. And it was the maneuvering of Stanton and Lincoln, Stanton and Dana that prevented this from happening. I wasn't the first to report this. David Donald's biography, Lincoln, does an excellent job on this, but I amplified Dana's role in preventing Lincoln from being too lenient, as was his wont. Dana was there for the assassination as well. Not exactly for the shooting, but he was called after the shooting by Stanton to come to the Peterson house across the street. And while Lincoln lay dying in the next room, it was Dana who wrote out telegrams to Grant, to Charles Francis Adam, our ambassador in England, telling them what had happened, and that Dana took a large part in directing arrests and supervising the manhunt for Booth and for the assassins, the other assassins. Very colorful stories in the book about that I can't go into now. Dana was actually responsible because his spy, Richard Montgomery, was like one of the star witnesses at the trial, not only accusing John Wilkes Booth, but supposedly showing how the trail of evidence led directly to Jefferson Davis and the Richmond, not just the Canadian agents, but the Richmond cabinet as well. Dana had actually picked up a cipher in Richmond from the desk of Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State, and it seemed to match the one that Booth had on his person that was found in Booth's papers. And so that was part of the trail that supposedly led back to Richmond. Finally, and Dana testified at the trial of the assassins. And finally, when Jefferson Davis was captured, fleeing in Georgia, supposedly wearing a woman's dress, at least so said General Wilson, Dana's friend, who reported that to Dana by telegram. Dana was sent down to supervise Davis's imprisonment at Fortress Monroe. For a while, it seemed necessary to put iron shackles around Davis's legs while the casement was being repaired. The bad move. Dana gave permission, but it was a bad move because it raised all kinds of sympathy for Jefferson Davis in the North. Eventually, Horace Greeley, Dana's nemesis, posted bail for Davis to be released from prison. Dana was a big Grant supporter right after the war, co-wrote a campaign biography, campaigned for Grant, but then turned against him. By 1872, Dana could not stand the corruption of the Grant administration, was disappointed that Grant had not made him collector of the Port of New York, had not given him a piece of the pork, and actually was beginning to soften on Reconstruction and take a more lenient stance on Reconstruction. And so he was part of he switched to the Democrats Party and ended up actually supporting Horace Greeley, of all people, during the 1872 election. It was his newspaper, the New York Sun, that broke the Credit Mobilier scandal in Grant's cabinet and continued to sort of harass the Republicans really for the rest of Dana's editorial career. He was most known for this 30-year career as editor of the fabulously successful New York Sun, not as a Civil War figure, but as a Gilded Age journalistic figure. Finally, Dana's story was pretty much untold until Sam McClure got the idea, as Civil War figures were dying, he got the idea of getting them interviewed. And so Ida Tarbell was assigned to interview Dana. The result, as I mentioned, was this seriously flawed recollections of the Civil War. Dana himself never wrote up his memoirs. And his friend, General James Wilson, did write a biography that was very useful to me because it has anecdotes and letters that are no longer around. There's the book, and I should stop there.
You mentioned the Sultana, right? Dana was involved in investigation of that?
Not exactly. He was involved. Let's see. The trail begins back in 1861 when Lincoln is besieged by all his Illinois cronies, for patronage posts. And one of his Illinois cronies was the Secretary of State of Illinois, Ozias Hatch, who had actually contributed, helped to put Lincoln's name in nomination in 1860. Ozias Hatch had a younger brother, Reuben Hatch, who was desperate, to do something for the Union effort and for himself. And so he asked Lincoln to appoint Ozias Hatch a quartermaster assistant quartermaster at Cairo, Illinois, which turned out to be a very important post because Cairo was where the entire Mississippi and Tennessee River offenses were supplied from. All the combined operations with troops and riverboats were supplied from there. Well, Reuben Hatch turns out pretty much to have, we're pretty certain to have been corrupt, taking kickbacks, skimming off profits, et cetera, et cetera. So much so that Grant ends up ordering an investigation, and Lincoln finds out about this and asks what can be done. Lincoln is under a lot of pressure from his Illinois cronies to get this investigation over with. Lincoln did do nothing untoward at all. He just asked if the investigation could be speeded up. In the end, Stanton appointed a claims commission to investigate all the vouchers and contracts. And Dana was appointed to that commission in summer of 1862. They cleared, it was too, what shall I say? It was too soft an investigation. And they cleared Reuben Hatch. And that enabled Lincoln.
Please mute everybody.
That enabled Lincoln and Grant to keep promoting this guy, Reuben Hatch. And ultimately, he was the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg at the end of the war. And he gave the go-ahead for this seriously overloaded steamboat to head up north.
Well, yeah, and I understand that the quartermaster and the guy in the scene was the brother of the Attorney General, Joshua Speed, who of course was Lincoln's good friend. And if Lincoln had lived, there may have been more of a scandal.
That's right. There certainly would have been more investigating. Frederick Speed, Captain Frederick Speed, was also one of the principals, right, who was involved. They were all pointing at each other, as to who let this boat go with 2,400 Union soldiers on a boat that was designed for 376 people. And the boilers had just been repaired, probably shoddily, and the overloading may not have caused the boilers to explode, but it certainly caused the horrific death toll once they did explode outside of Memphis. And over 1,700 men died. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was horrible. And yeah, it's interesting.
Worst maritime disaster, I think, prior to Pearl Harbor in America.
Yeah, it was all these guys who were coming back from Andersonville. It was terrible.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I know about the book from Wilson, but apparently when Dana first got to Vicksburg, he was very antagonistic, and I think he was even a pallbearer at his funeral. Wilson was.
That's right. They became really good friends, and part of it was they saw eye to eye on a lot of things, but part of it also was a mutual assistance thing where Wilson was a West Pointer, a young engineer who could sort of show Dana the military operations, the earthworks, the forts, could initiate him into military things. And Dana, as an older man with influence with the government, could actually help Wilson get promoted, which he did.
Okay, so it looks like we have questions in the chat, I hope. Yes, somebody, let's see, John Anderson, good. Can you expand on your sources for this excellent study on Dana?
Yeah, I'm very impressed with how you're able to do this kind of research on this particular figure who is, as you amazingly point out, is the grease between so many of the episodes, generals, and aspects of the Civil War. How did you do it in terms of getting this kind of information?
Thank you for noticing that, because Dana famously kept nothing. He had that from his journalistic days. He had a habit of reading things, responding to them, crumpling them up and throwing them in the garbage. And so there was really, the Charles Dana papers in the Library of Congress are very spare, extremely spare. So a lot of it was ferreting around 5 letters here, 5 letters there, in different collections all around the country. Fortunately, there were some very good caches of correspondence. One of them is up in Maine. James Shepard Pike was a Tribune correspondent who had been based in Washington. So there are lots of letters back and forth between Dana and Pike that actually start in the mid-1850s, but they do go up into the Civil War years. Wilson himself kept a diary. James Wilson, I mentioned that he wrote some memoirs that have a lot of good letters and anecdotes that are, especially the letters are now lost. But the main thing really was the National Archives. Thousands and thousands of telegrams that Dana wrote, either from the field back to Lincoln and Stanton, or from his office in the War Department, many on routine business, but a lot of the business was not routine. If you piece together the correspondence, you see important things happening. And some of it was actually personal too. It gave me personal information as well. So I must have read 4,000 or 5,000 letters and telegrams in the National Archives on microfilm, and found here and there, pieces that were extremely,
How long did it take you? Because that's a very tedious kind of research where you're on the back streets of, the history.
It's hard to say because this book was on my back burner, simmering on the back burner for a long, long time. I first got the idea in the late 1990s, and then I put it aside, and I've only been seriously working on it the last 8-9 years or so. But yeah, these were long stints at the Library of Congress and the National Archives of tedious note-taking from microfilms, and then piecing things together when I got back home.
Thank you. I live a mile from St. Mary's, so I'm real proud of you.
Oh, how wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay, there was a question about if you came across any reference that Dana had a home in Glen Cove, New York on Long Island, because Martin Burns asked because it is my hometown, and this was a local legend.
Yes, I have not been there, and I don't think the home exists anymore, but it was on a small island that was connected by a sort of causeway, Desaurus Island. That is where Dana purchased a house and then expanded it, I think, and built a club room with a sort of billiard room, and had it landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, his friend, the Central Park landscape architect. And I don't know how long that stayed in the family or how long that old mansion was around. I don't think it's there anymore. Dana is buried in, I think it's St. Paul's Church in Glen Cove, nearby.
I think Paul wants to know more about the utopian group that Dana was in.
Yeah, Brook Farm. We're talking about a transcendentalist, originally a transcendentalist community that was established in West Roxbury in 1841 by George Ripley, a Unitarian minister, and it became a magnet for reformers, literati, nobody, unfortunately, who knew enough about actual farming, which is kind of typical of so many of these utopian communities. They set up, their most successful operation was a school where Dana taught German and Greek to basically grade school and high school age kids. And that was really what kept the community going until it lost too many resources in that fire of 1846. It converted, toward the end of the community's life, they converted to the utopian theories of Charles Fourier, this French utopian socialist. And that's what really got Dana involved in being interested in the 1848 revolution and the French radicals who toppled Louis Philippe. And that's what got him over there. to meet Karl Marx, even though he did not agree with Marx on the idea of, violent overthrow, proletarian revolution, that sort of thing.
David Kent said he much enjoyed reading your book, and that's from one author to another. So
that's right. Thank you. That comes from a person I respect very much.
Okay, Daniel Gray says Peter Cozen's book on Chattanooga shows how Dana interfered with a planned attack by the Lightning Brigade. Yeah, I know about those guys, but I didn't know Dana interfered with their attack. It's on page 395 and 96 of Cozen's book.
Yeah, I go into that in great detail in the book. Yeah, this is when Dana was separated during the Confederate breakthrough at Chickamauga. Dana was separated from Rosecrans, and he headed south to see if Sheridan was still there and his army. They weren't, but Dana bumped into Colonel John T. Wilder and his Indiana Brigade, who were equipped with Spencer rifles. Thanks actually to Dana and Wilson, who had sort of outfitted that brigade earlier in the war. And Dana told, there are conflicting accounts, let's just say, of the encounter. Dana told Wilder that all was lost, that Rosecrans' army, there was a big Confederate breakthrough, that Wilder's army was in the air, cut off from the rest of the Union Army, and he should head north to guard the approaches to Chattanooga, guard the retreat to Chattanooga at Lookout Mountain. And Wilder hesitated. Dana identified himself as the Assistant Secretary of War. Wilder said Dana gave him an order. Dana said he did not. So there's a lot of he said, she said about this stuff. And Wilder told the story 3 times in different decades. And every time he told the story, it got more and more embellished, that he was on the verge of victory with his Spencer rifles, et cetera, et cetera. My opinion, and I think a lot of people agree with me, there's no way that Wilder could have come up on the rear of Longstreet's army and decimated it, or really saved the day. It was the Snodgrass Hill stand of Thomas that saved the day. And actually Sheridan had sent a message to Wilder at the same time, a horseback messenger, saying, get the hell out of there and head back to Chattanooga, to cover the retreat. And Wilder was actually decorated for covering that retreat successfully. But, to his dying day, he insisted that he could have turned the whole battle around. And Dana, to tell the truth, Dana in his recollections embellished his own story, saying, oh, I told him to go. I didn't tell him to go back to Chattanooga. I told him to go help Thomas, who was at Snodgrass Hill. Well, Dana had no inkling that Thomas was at Snodgrass Hill at that point. So that was like wishful remembering, he wished he had said something like that. So they both, this is a problem with post-war memoirs, right? They both embellished heavily. And as far as I can tell from the contemporaneous sources, Dana counseled Wilder to do the right thing, which is to get the hell out of there. And there were 2 other people, Sheridan and a man named Gates Thurston, who was McCook's chief of staff, who told Wilder the same thing: get the hell out of there.
Yeah, that's pretty common in these Civil War vets. Gary Gallagher always talks about that, which leads to Bill Benzel's next question, actually. What are the most significant historical errors in the 1898 recollections?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Well, there's a bunch of them. So one of them concerns Dana's lobbying for the 13th Amendment. Ida Tarbell got that story completely wrong. She put it a year earlier, and she had Dana lobbying for the admission of Nevada as a state to the Union, completely misunderstanding the context, because she misread one of Dana's own speeches that he had given in the 1890s, where if you read it carefully, it's clear that it's about the 13th Amendment. There's also a famous telegram or non-telegram that Dana supposedly sent. I mean, Rosecrans champions, pro-Rosecrans historians are quick to say that Dana sabotaged Rosecrans by talking him down at Washington, and particularly by making up this final telegram of, I forgot, October 18th or 19th, 1863, a telegram to Stanton saying, unless you order him, Rosecrans, to stay in Chattanooga, he is giving orders to retreat. So you must either replace him or give or issue peremptory orders right now. Well, there's no such telegram. This is completely from Ulysses S. Grant's memory. So Grant remembered that Stanton, when they were meeting in Louisville, and then Indianapolis, I've forgotten where they actually encountered each other, in both places, but I've forgotten where this actually happened. I think it was in Louisville. Anyway, Grant remembered that Stanton was agitated, that Stanton said they were already carrying orders to replace Rosecrans. But he remembered that Stanton was agitated because he had received another telegram from Dana, warning about the dire situation, but not saying that Rosecrans was going to abandon Chattanooga. That telegram does not exist. But this is how Grant remembered it. He put it into memoirs, and Ida Tarbell, when she was writing Grant's memoirs, when she was writing Dana's memoirs, read Grant's memoirs and injected a bunch of that material into Dana's supposed recollections. So it actually appears twice in Dana's recollections, but it's taken straight out of Grant's faulty memoirs. And Dana's never said anything of the kind or wrote any telegram like that. So those are two of the biggest goofs that are in the ghost-written recollections.
Very good. And John Anderson said that I think the problem with the Sultana boiler was a quick, bad, cheap patch that was applied prior to the sail upriver, which is true, but it wouldn't have mattered if it had not been so overloaded too, probably.
Well,
they had horses and whatnot on there too, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
It was totally overloaded.
Even if the overloading didn't cause the boilers to strain, when they did explode, there were that many more people there to die.
That's right.
Yeah.
This is Mike Cohen. I have been looking for a book that gives me a good understanding of all of the communications in the Civil War. Does anyone have a recommendation, a book or a number of books or whatever, a source for me to just do some personal research?
There's a popular book that isn't all that good, but it's mostly about the Virginia campaign. It's called Lincoln's T-Mails by Tom Wheeler. It's about the telegraph setup that Lincoln had with the Virginia front. But this aspect of the war has been really, really understudied. In fact, at a previous Zoom Civil War Roundtable that I gave a talk to, someone asked me an intriguing question that I just couldn't answer, and that is, how could Dana's telegrams from Chattanooga get out and reach Stanton during the period before the Cracker Line was established, and before that a telegraph was set up along that long 60-mile overland road? I found the dates when the communication along that road was established, but I know from the evidence, the telegrams did get through, but I have no idea. They did not come through Knoxville. They did not come through the river. I'm not sure how they happened. And it's part of the heroism, the sort of unsung heroism of the Signal Corps and the telegraph units, that were able to do this, to achieve these kinds of feats.
Yeah, there's a book, it's on Amazon, I think. It's called Lincoln in the Telegraph Office, Recollections of the United States Military Telegraph Corps during the Civil War.
That's
Okay.
David Homer Bates, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was a young.
right,
telegrapher.
David Homer Bates, right.
Telegraph Corps was highly organized. Whenever they bivouacked, they'd have the lines on mules
Ah,
and then they would send them out like in a very organized fashion. It's really a marvel.
It's unbelievable. I say in the book that during the Battle of Chickamauga, the first day, Rosecrans's headquarters, Dana and Rosecrans's headquarters, they were in better communication with Washington, D.C. than they were with their troops that were 2 miles down the valley, you know, in the thick of the battle.
yes, that's my question. How did all those things happen? For example, Sheridan, when he was doing his thing down there in Georgia and so forth, he was able to tell, of course, Lincoln and a bunch of people where he was and what he was doing. Sounded to me like it was almost in real time. I don't understand how they were able to do all those things.
There were times when the connection was broken quite frequently, and there were also times when they had to use river routes in addition to the wire routes, and that slowed things down. But where they were able to keep the lines open, or even run an underground cable from Virginia, from Norfolk to the Delmarva Peninsula, you know, that southern tip of Maryland there,
Yes.
there was an underground telegraph cable, so they could bypass all the Confederate saboteurs, and they could have very, very quick communication between, say, Grant in Virginia and Washington, D.C.
This is Steve Jaron. I
Yeah, I see.
put a link on the chat. There's a signal corps association that contains links dealing with communication that the gentleman might like to check out.
Thanks for attending. And again, thanks, Carl, for a great presentation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you for your good questions and your attention.
Thank you, Carl. Great
Thank
job.
you, Carl.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.
We're 10